Leech is gone, and we are in a new meta. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I think the fairest place to start is with the deck that I had a ton of success with, and this is going to be the representative of Cannonball Profex decks, but there are a variety of them, and there's going to be a couple more CBall Profex decks on this list as well. This one I'm just using as an example of something that is closer to a pure clog strategy. Now, why is Pure Clog relevant right now? Well, the number one reason is because the major metagame threats are Bounce and Hela, and Pure Clog tends to be pretty good into both of those things. I'm running Daredevil in here because I like having training wheels. I genuinely do. There are plenty of things you can do to mess around with this deck generally, though. The main thing I want to get across is that the main things that the metagame is about are Bounce and Hela, and the main ways to attack that are cards like Debris, Professor X, White Widow, and Cannonball. This deck, while not being necessarily the deck the metagame is about, is a deck that is built to beat what the metagame is about. And I think that speaks to what I really make these videos for. These videos are something of a summary of the metagame rather than a definition of what to do to beat it. And I think I wanted to highlight this at the beginning of this video so everyone gets the idea, because I get a lot of comments that are like, oh, KM, I have a deck that's really good into this stuff. Great. I want that. I want you to take this video and then say, how do I beat what's on here? Because that is how you can get the most utility out of it. This deck was built to beat Bounce and was built to beat Hela, and it manages to accomplish both of those things with aplomb. Having Daredevil and Professor X also gives you game into just like random matchups where you can just scam out a lane and figure something out and make it work, but specifically, it is about those two matchups. So what does Bounce even look like right now? I think there are effectively three schools of Bounce, and it remains to be seen which one is the best. My personal pick, actually, would be the one without Werewolf by Night. And I know that's like a little bit of an odd thing, but I think this version of the Bounce deck was so strong already that Werewolf doesn't actually do as much for it as you'd think. Now, the deviations here are fairly straightforward. This is the basic no werewolf bounce list, which means you are able to include things like Mysterio, you are able to include things like Bishop that would not particularly be seen in other versions of this list. US Agent, also notable here, is just mostly a big guy, a 2'7 to 2'11 a decent amount of the time. That's really all he's trying to accomplish here. Very much a flex slot, but I do think he's a very good stat stick in a deck that doesn't necessarily need another stat stick, but is very interested in playing one regardless. So starting here, this is baseline no werewolf bounce. I think this one has the highest points upside of all of the decks that we are going to look at today in the bounce category, because it is just so chock full of incredibly good cards on rate. People like to think of Bounce as like a mid-range deck or something. I actually think it's more accurately described as a combo deck. This is a deck that gets to combo deck numbers and gets to pick where those numbers go. This deck plays like a combo deck. It has the matchup spread of a combo deck, i.e. it loses to Clog, Professor X stuff, and things that go taller. And that is just a really remarkable thing to, really realize. This is actually just a combo deck that pretends to be something other than a combo deck. The next direction that you can try to take the Bounce archetype is this one. I consider it a little bit more of a hybridization. I believe LamBounce series was the first person to arrive at this list, but fundamentally, it's just one of the old school Annihilus bounce lists, updated a little bit for the modern era. I think this is a totally acceptable and good option to play. I think it's a very solid deck. I think it has much of the same weaknesses as the other bounce lists, but it also has just generally powerful cards. So even if you're not executing a bounce game plan, you are still very able to play a mid-range game. This, as opposed to being a combo deck, is very much more a mid-range deck. This is sort of the bounce spectrum, right? Like there is a spectrum of where bounce exists, where there's like the pure combo version of bounce, there's the slightly more mid-rangey version of bounce, which is this, and there is, of course, Darkhawk bounce as well. Interestingly, this is the one I had the most success with personally, and again, it's hybridizing this combo with a little bit of interaction, and that is generally how bounce is sort of trying to figure out what actually makes sense here. In this case, the interaction is just putting rocks in your opponent's deck, right? In the previous case, the interaction was, a little bit of Iceman, a little bit of Annihilus stuff. You have interaction in the deck, but not really a ton. And in the first deck, a version of the bounce deck that we saw, it was basically no interaction at all, and everything was about the points. So think of these decks as sort of on a spectrum from pure combo to like hybrid combo mid-range, right? I personally believe that the most powerful of the bounce decks is going to be the pure combo list because of the way it matches up into the other bounce decks. When you are in a bounce mirror, generally what really matters is just numbers. That's the only thing that matters. And so this hybridization to be a little bit more of a like fair mid-range deck, it actually seems to hurt you in the mirrors in my experience. Whereas the pure combo bounce deck, the first one that we saw, is good in the mirrors and sort of by definition ends up in a good spot across a lot of different matchups. Now, what these decks gain is a little bit of utility into the decks that are trying to beat them. Things like Professor X decks, Clog decks, right? Like these decks are a little bit better into those because A, you get either the rocks or the ability to Annihilus stuff, a variety of different things that can go right for you. However, you are in this situation where you're just probably going to have less points in the straight up mirror. Hela is an absolutely elite deck that you absolutely need to account for. An excellent points combo deck. It does feel right now to me that we are in a bit of a combo meta. This is a metagame that is dominated by Bounce, by Hela. Those are public enemies number 1 and 2. And because of their prevalence, you end up in a situation where a lot of things need to have a viable plan or they just get run over when they queue into either of these decks. Now, I think that was a fairly predictable outcome of the Leech nerf, which is these are decks that were very much being held back by Leech, not necessarily overly. And now when you look at this, Hela is excellent, Bounce is excellent, Cannonball decks to counter those two decks are very good. So you end up in this scenario where there's like a little bit of a triangle. It's just kind of hard to figure out how other decks insert themselves into it. Hela, of course, has another version as well, and that is with the inclusion of Corvus Glaive, aiming for just as absolutely most power as you can get. I think that in theory, this should make you favored in mirrors, like in the aggregate, but you're unlikely to notice it game to game. But generally speaking, being able to have more power in a combo mirror is typically the way to beat that mirror. We talked about this a little bit in the bounce lists conversation where it was like, well, which one of these actually wins the mirror? And it's typically just the one that does the most points. So for that reason, while I do think that it is a more consistent, better deck if you are playing the Husky version like we did in our previous video, I think that there is a coherent argument for just saying, no, I actually just need the most points here. I'm going to try to win Hela mirrors like that. I'm not sure if I would approach Hela mirrors in that way, but I do think it is a plausible approach to most mirrors in the game, saying what matters here and how do I get more of that thing that matters. Okay, so we made it through the Hela and Bounce conversation. I realize that's like kind of a lot to take in, but they are sort of the metagame baselines. The dueling metagame baselines here are just, you're going to need to have a plan for all this combo stuff. So this is a Loki list I got from Batman. I believe the first person I saw playing a Cannonball Profex Loki deck was Dubas a few weeks ago. However, in this context, I think it's doing things that are a little bit different. I don't like that I am forced to do this, but I think if you are going to play Loki, you need to have a coherent plan into Hela and into Bounce. And the only way Loki can have a coherent plan into Hela and into Bounce is to be a Profex Cannonball deck. You can kind of see the triangle forming here, right? There's Bounce, there's Hela, there's Profex Cannonball. That's kind of what the metagame feels like it's about right now. When you are building a new deck, when you're brewing, when you're in the tank, you need to figure out how your stuff matches up into those three things. What camp are you in? Is there another deck doing the thing you're doing better? Because that is what the metagame is about, to the degree that even Loki is running this combination of cards. One last Profex Cannonball deck before we dive into the other things that you can actually try to play in this meta. I get it. We've done a lot of, Profex Cannonball, Hela, Bounce, right? But we're going to get those out of the way, and then we're going to talk about some fun decks, some interesting stuff that I've been seeing that is also pretty good. So this is, of course, the SafetyBlade list that has been Good, except for the brief moment where Leech was super, super elite. This is, of course, another Profx Cannonball deck. It's just using a different sort of shell to do the points thing. I think that when you look at this list, the Loki list, the first list that we talked about today, they're all attempting to attack the metagame from the same position and arriving at different methods of doing so. That's actually fairly common in the early days of a metagame, where this is the kind of thing that you're going to see a lot of, is people trying to figure out what the best Cannonball Profx deck is, what the best Hela deck is, what the best Bounce deck is, and gradually that sort of gets shaved down. But as is, I do think this is a very strong contender for being the best Cannonball Profx deck. It is excellent, using Ravonna to great effect, generating an absolutely massive amount of stats, and some very powerful fill-up one-lane Profexit win game off of Cannonball situations. That is a massive pole of this metagame, and building towards it is very strong. The inclusion of Sage gives you like a bit of a mix-up as well, especially if you're able to Hope Summers your way, and you have a Ravonna, you have 7 energy, your final turn is Sage Cannonball. Those are basically unlosable games, and this deck gets to play what looks like a normal game of Marvel Snap, while also having this absolute I win, lock it up combo of Profx Cannonball to make sure that as a fair deck, it does not get run over by combo decks doing unfair things like Bounce and Hela. Yo Woody's build of Silver Surfer is honestly pretty good into a lot of stuff. There is like a little bit of like, I'm not really sure we have enough consistent points to deal with, you know, Hela, to deal with Bounce, but we have a lot of consistent points and a lot of ways to make your opponent really feel unpleasant about the decisions they've made. This is also a deck that is typically extremely good into Profx Cannonball decks because of the way it is able to fill up so many spots on the board. It's not good if you're getting debris, but if you're playing against that SafetyBlade deck, for example, you end up in a situation where it's like, oh, it's kind of hard to actually lose this game to a Professor X. Now, it's easy to lose this game to other Clog, but it's hard to lose it to a Professor X because of the way the deck plays out. Silver Surfer is underrated at this point. There's a lot of really good tech in here, to the point that I don't particularly think that this deck lacks something specific. If it lacks anything, it is points. And you can see that because this deck is playing all the biggest threes. Sebastian Shaw, Gladiator, both inclusions here because we are trying to compete on points with decks like Bounce and Hela. And if you are trying to compete on points, you really need to actually be able to do that. In deck building, you have to plan for that. That's what's been done here. In addition, there is some upside to being a Brood deck, an Absorbing Man deck. If your opponent is relying on Sage, it's not the greatest upside in the world, but if we can get close enough, that upside might be able to take us over the line in that matchup. This Cerebro 3 list won LamB Series' tournament. Now, I don't know exactly how much stock to put into that. It's hard for me to understand how much it matters to win a tournament in the current day and age when there's just so few of them actually happening. It's very difficult for me to understand that. That said, I will choose to ignore that because I've actually had Cerebro 3 on like 2 tier lists in the last month. I thought this deck was kind of playable anyway, and now I get to be like, haha, I was right about that. So, you know, haha, I was right. Cerebro 3 is, again, like, I'm not sure it's the best deck in the world. It's just an actually good functional one. And when people talk about what made this deck like legitimately playable, I think it's like this preponderance of tech and points options that it has now. There's just so much that it got going for it. And now with the addition of Luke Cage, it's a lot harder to like disrupt it for free the way that some locations can do, some decks can do. There's really things going for this. I thought this deck was pretty good before Luke Cage. Now, of course, you're a Luke Cage US Agent deck. Again, there's really a lot going for this deck, as much as has been going for it basically ever, I think. And that's really good. Like, that's just a really good thing when Cerebro is actually a deck that can go on these tier lists. So I am super happy to put it on here. I do think that it attacks the metagame in some unique ways. It has some real potential at being a real good deck. I do think that this is something that can do some damage, and that is a very nice sentence to say. I have here Stefan's build of Supergiant, and I will say the major thing that has happened to Supergiant is that it's gotten a little bit smaller. There are sort of 2 builds to do right now. The other build would be to replace the Hood, Sentry, and Annihilus with Killmonger, Ronin, and Claw, right? That's really the package that's in flux. The rest of what's going on here is sort of is not really up for debate, I would say. A lot of very powerful 3 and fewer cost cards, a lot of cards that are built to do, 3+3 on the final turn of the game, or 3+2 on a turn 5 under a Supergiant, things of that nature. I think that Supergiant is in an interesting spot right now because a lot of bounce decks are like, okay, I want to beast on turn 5 because the thing only happens one turn now. You can really put them in an awkward spot with Supergiant. Hela, unfortunately, you just kind of mostly get outpointed by. That's just the thing you're going to have to deal with. Maybe you can get rid of a blink or whatever, but it's not a great matchup in my experience. And of course, you have the ability to really shut down decks that are relying on Professor X on turn 5. So Supergiant good against, I would say, 2 of the 3 pillars of the metagame. And then the specifics of like all the awkward, weird tech stuff that you have. Like, there is so much weird tech in this deck, and a lot of being good at this deck is using that weird tech to maximum effect against people who don't know what to expect. Shuri Exists. It's not my favorite solution to this metagame because of just how hard it is to play this deck into a Professor X deck, but it is a deck that puts a lot of points on the board, can reasonably contest a Hela, can reasonably contest a bounce deck. It's not necessarily, the best at doing those things, but it does consistently put a large number of points on the board, and when you put a large number of points on the board, you can contest other decks that are built around putting a large number of points on the board. That is a valid thing. The question is whether or not you're actually going to be favored into those. I'm not particularly sure. I know Shuri Enjoyer has been playing Shuri into the top 20, and that's a real accomplishment at this point. I'm very proud of that happening. I don't know if this is his exact list. I have opted for something a little bit more I would say traditional here. I do think that it is crucially important. I've liked in the past cutting Red Skull here, but when you're going up against Hela and you're going up against things like Bounce, you kind of need to super high roll, right? You don't really have the luxury of being like, I don't need Red Skull here. You kind of need to do Sauron into Shuri into Red Skull Taskmaster. Like, that's kind of what needs to happen, and you need to build for that, unfortunately. The average points per game, now that Blink is gone, I feel like has gone up dramatically, and that has necessitated this change in the deck, to me at least. Finally, I don't know who exactly made this. I know that Big Baby has been messing around in this space. I know KX4N has been messing around in this space. I believe this 12 comes from Jeff Hoagland, though. I'm not positive. And I tried it, and it was fine, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with this. It was fine. I did feel like the main thing that happened when I played this deck was I picked it up. I was like, okay, this is mostly just good cards. These are like decent to good cards. There's no cards in here that are like actively trash. Crossbones maybe, Typhoid Mary maybe, but you have ways of mitigating that, right? And so you have this effective thing where the real thing this deck is trying to do is just scar people. And that like happens via Namora. You get like your giant Nocturne, your giant Captain Marvel. You get a cheap Scar. That stuff's super dope. And then it's a question of like what tech cards you want to pair with it. You have the Loot Cage, which is very good right now. You have Armor to stop yourself from getting Shang-Chi'd. You have a bunch of good tech to go with it. But honestly, it felt like this deck was just, pretty good, rather than, oh my god, I'm so happy with it. And another thing that struck me was it felt like this deck relied a lot on your opponent not knowing what your range was. And now that it's on this video, it was on Jeff's video, I think people are going to be more familiar with the range of the output that this deck can do, and that is a bad thing for the deck. So overall, I think this is actually totally playable, but it's definitely like the honorable mention kind of playable. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed that look at the metagame. I do think that it's fair to say early on, this is not definitive. I hope things change in the metagame, but right now it's certainly starting to look like a Bounce Hela Prof X metagame, just like it was before Leech was buffed to begin with. Now, how do you feel about that? Are you happy with how this metagame is looking? Are you into how this is shaped up? Let me know in the comments. I still read every single one of them. As always, I've been KMBest. I hope you enjoy the KM Boost. You've been phenomenal, and I'll see you in the next one.